Hey everyone, welcome back to the Pillar Performance Podcast. I'm Jared from Team Pillar. I just wanted to jump on here quickly to give you a background about what's to come in the episode. Demo interviews Scott Tindal and about his background from starting as a physiotherapist, then to working in the team sport realm, and now helping endurance athletes through his online nutrition platform, Fuelin. Later in the episode, they dive deep into actionable steps that everyday endurance athletes can take to optimize their nutrition. We hope you enjoy this one. If you had any questions or feedback, leave them in the Q&A section on Spotify. You can leave a comment on YouTube or just leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Anyway, we'll see you in the next one.
Everyone, welcome back to 2023. It's a pleasure to be back. We had a bit of a nice break over Christmas with the podcast, but at the end of last year, for those of you who are listening, recall that I did say that we had some things planned in the works this year. Our plan was to continue to work with yourselves to educate, and we wanted to bring the best minds of sports science and nutrition onto the podcast to obviously provide really unique perspectives on what's going on in terms of the lay of the land at the moment in sport for athletes of all kinds as well. But we know, on the Pillar podcast, we're going to be focusing on endurance. So to kick off 2023, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome this guest, Scott Tindal. Now, Scott is someone that I have personally learned so much from my journey into nutrition. I mean, I don't ever claim to be an absolute genius in terms of understanding everything that I know about nutrition. I learned from people like Scott. And today I want to introduce Scott as a guest, and I envision that there'll be more than one episode where Scott is going to come on. So I think for everyone here, it's an awesome opportunity to learn Scott's background. Scott is a performance nutritionist with over 20 years experience working with pro and amateur athletes. It's very unique to find someone who holds degrees in both sports medicine and sports nutrition. And Scott has worked across an array of high performance sports with some of the highest profile organizations in the world, the Toronto Maple Leafs in the NHL, and also Oracle Team USA in the America's Cup sailing. Scott's since gone on to co-found Fuelin, which is an app-based personalization nutrition coaching program. And now they can say that there's some of the highest profile triathletes in the world now active users on the site. So Scotty, it's a pleasure. Welcome to bringing in the Pillar Podcast of 2023. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Damo. Very thorough introduction, actually, but I certainly will just say that I'm not the expert in terms of who claims to know everything about that. And I think any expert who says they know everything, you've probably got to be very wary of. So constantly learning, constantly leaning in and learning from people who are above my pay grade. And I think that's really important.
You and me both, mate. Look, I thought for listeners today, as I said, we will have other episodes where we'll dive into some deeper topics. But I just wanted to introduce your background. I mean, as I said there, it's a long journey into where you are today. So take us right from the beginning.
Yeah, it is interesting. It's funny when you hear it sort of talk back to you and relayed to you. But yeah, I mean, I started actually as a physiotherapist. So I studied physiotherapy at the University of Sydney out at Cumberland way back in 97, being at St Andrews College at Sydney Uni. So it was a journey from there. I guess the physio, you spent a lot of time in the physio room. You and I both played rugby and both got injured, unfortunately. So it seemed like a good career choice at that time. And yeah, it had a number of years. I think I was a physio effectively. I mean, I still am a physio, but haven't necessarily been practicing as much as what I used to. But, it's 20 odd years now of being a physio. From there, I moved to the UK and was very lucky, worked in professional rugby with Leicester Tigers, with Harlequin Rugby, worked with GB Rowing, Paralympics, with the blind wrestlers as a physiotherapist. And during that time I did my Masters in Sports Exercise Medicine at the University of London, Queen Mary, and somehow managed to gain a distinction in that. It's always interesting when you go and study because you actually want to go and study out of choice as opposed to doing your bachelor's where you're sort of thrown in the mix. So that was good. And after doing that, that really piqued my interest in nutrition. And I think one of the modules there that we did, or a couple of the modules within that Masters, were specifically around performance nutrition. And from there, it really got me sort of thinking about the role of nutrition and recovery, especially in light of injury as a physiotherapist, and seeing the value of nutrition. And I ended up doing postgraduate diploma in performance nutrition, which really was sort of the stepping stone, I think, for me to then make that transition into thinking about doing nutrition as a full-time career. And London sort of finished, and I got offered, and was lucky enough to be offered a role with Oracle Team USA, as you said, for the 35th America's Cup, which was based in Bermuda. And The role there was head physio and team nutritionist for those sailors and for the team. And yeah, it was an amazing opportunity to really put into practice what I had learnt from the sports medicine masters, but also from that postgraduate study, nutrition, and really apply it in a practical sense.
I'm interested for those, and I might just while we're on Oracle, because it's probably one of the lesser known disciplines for a lot of people out there. But while maybe lesser known, definitely not lesser funded, which is very interesting. I thought, could you just dive in, just explain a little bit about what the process was leading into as America's Cup? How does it work? Obviously, what resources were at hand? Because I know you and I, we were very touching base often during that period, and the program was very well funded from a high performance perspective, which I think a lot of people wouldn't understand. But do you just want to touch on potentially what were the takeaways from that experience with the America's Cup team, and particularly the Team USA that you guys assembled at the time?
Yeah, I mean, you talk about planning, so we all relocated to Bermuda from all around the world, and I guess it was 2.5 years of planning and building a number of boats and in preparation for that period of time with the Louis Vuitton Cup and then the America's Cup. And, 6 sailors on the boat, 12 sailors in the total team, every single day building towards that one goal. From a training perspective, every day was, we worked with a trainer called, or head of performance. His name was Craig McFarlane, or Oscar as is affectionately known. And everything was planned to the day, planned to the hour. I mean, we had morning training sessions, afternoon sailing sessions. If we weren't doing sailing due to weather, then there was cross training involved. I mean, there was swimming, there was weights training, there was, in the shed doing the grinding, which is how we powered the boat. Obviously the Kiwis went for leg power, we went for arm power, and some people will say that was the key element that resulted in them winning the cup. I think most of the sailors and most of the people who were in the know that that wasn't actually the case, but it certainly had an impact on it.
And I think what we're looking at, your journey's taken you from a young rugby player into rugby as the first, I suppose the doorstep into professional sport. Then you said there was rowing, wrestling, sailing, and obviously now into more, if we say Fuelin is very much directed and focused at the triathlete at this stage, has used.
When there was the hockey players as well thrown in between,
and let's not leave out the NHL as well, that little league in North America as well. I'm keen to know, mate, what are some of the most discernible differences between? I mean, these disciplines, obviously all of them having some sort of aerobic element to them, but anaerobically incredibly different from a nutrition and physio perspective. How did you adapt? What did you learn along the way?
Yeah, I think, something like the sailing had a high component of anaerobic sort of systems, but it also had a huge aerobic capacity. Those guys, for the races were around 20 minutes, but they were working at, 90% of their VO2 max for that 20 minutes. And, so there was an endurance component to it, but they also had to work at very high intensity for short periods of time in order to maintain that. So I'd probably put the sailing more in the realm of rugby, where it was sort of sustained efforts with bursts of high intensity. So you have to look at all those energy systems and cope with that. So, nutrition, obviously we were fairly heavy on carbohydrates because it was required for nutrition, but calories, obviously, if they're out there training and they're on the water for 6 or 7 hours at a time, it's a calorie management system as well, making sure that they're eating enough and trying to get whole foods into them as well as supplements. And then you go into something like the ice hockey, which is purely, an anaerobic sport. There's not much endurance in there. You look at the time on the ice, and some of the athletes would only be on the ice for 2 minutes. Some of them might be on there for 18 minutes, but it's all short bursts. So then you're thinking, okay, carbohydrates do play a role in that, but it's also that phosphocreatine system, that short burst of energy, training that appropriately, thinking about supplements that could maximize that potential. So instantly things that come to mind is things like caffeine and beta-alanine in that sense, which may be useful for then we go into endurance athletes. Caffeine certainly is going to be something we can use for an endurance athlete and an Ironman athlete, but is beta-alanine potentially a good supplement to use. You could argue that if it improves sprint performance in training and they can do more repeated sprint efforts, then over time that consistency and that adherence to doing more and more repeated sprints could actually result in adaptation down the line. But if you're talking about taking beta-alanine in an actual Ironman race, I'd probably say you're wasting your money. So that's sort of how I approach it. It's thinking about, as you said, thinking about the specificity of what the sport is resulting in the athlete having to cope with, and then sort of working backwards from the mechanistic standpoint of that, and then looking at from a practical standpoint, and what does the science say in terms of food or macronutrients, and then supplements on top of that.
I'd be interested to get your take as well, because I think it's not focused enough when you talk about the broader performance, let's call it professional high performance in global sport. What I found really interesting in my career, going from Australia into Europe, was the cultural differences in terms of, I suppose the differences and the nuances when it came to culture and nutrition. Because obviously I went from Australia into France, and we all know that the French have a very certain way of eating regarding their whole foods. I would be interested to get your take. You went obviously to the NHL, you were dealing with a team that had players, I imagine you would have had players from Scandinavia, Russia, North America predominantly, but from what you found, and then potentially dealing with British rugby players, rowers, how did you find that culture potentially made your life a little bit tricky when you had to think about how you were programming nutrition across those different sports?
Yeah, certainly don't try and introduce Vegemite as step one. That's probably key learning in North America. I didn't do it first. I didn't do it first up.
Yeah,
but
and
I did try.
For those of the listeners, obviously there's an Australian twang on this podcast, but Vegemite is something as Australians we're very proud of, but also probably not our finest export overseas as well.
It doesn't matter how much you try and convince someone that it's packed full of B vitamins and also is nutritional yeast, which people waste their money on. But, it's a fantastic food product in the eyes of an Aussie, but for North Americans, not so much. So, look, cultural differences, I think, it's an interesting one because, I think even from... you go into a sport like rugby, and it depends on the sport as well, how professional that sportsman is. And I think you're going to have varying degrees of professionalism even within each sport. So, certainly working in rugby, I can think of, a handful of players. Working at Leicester at the time, we had pretty much the whole of the England team and half of Ireland and Scotland and whatnot in the team. But, players like Lewis Moody, Martin Corrie, Castro Giovanni, all these players, they were extremely professional in their approach to their sport. When we talked about injury management or injury prevention, nutrition, body composition, they were very dialed in, and that's why they were the best. You take that then to, into the ice hockey realm, and there were some very professional players. John Tavares is one that springs to mind at the Maple Leafs, and he was extremely dialed in with his nutrition and the way he approached the game, and hence why he's one of the best in the world. But then you had other players who really didn't put any emphasis on their nutrition, and I think that's probably why they probably are the player that they are. And I think that sort of leaked into other areas of the game as well, whether it be strength and conditioning or maybe applying themselves to the management of the game as well. So I think, culturally you have to be on point with what the team is willing to accept. When I can think again of the Maple Leafs, and actually talking about Oracle, so something we introduced early on because we were really conscious of trying to get good quality nutrition into them is, the offering of salads in the morning. So salads at breakfast. Now, that culturally for a lot of people is not something that a lot of people do, but thankfully, within that team, it was predominantly Australians and some Americans within the team. And so the explanation of why we should have salad in terms of increasing micronutrient intake, increasing fiber intake, allowing them to consume some carbohydrates in that form without, and thinking of getting that total amount in. Once that concept was sort of relayed to them, and also for those individuals who maybe needed to work on a little bit of body composition, it was a very easy way of keeping up the feeling of fullness, getting appropriate nutrition in and doing that. Now, introducing that into Canada with some hockey players, a little bit more difficult. And you talked about things like the Scandinavians and that, and the Eastern Europeans. it was really interesting looking at their approach, because a lot of them were actually, whatever you said they did, because you're the person in charge of the team and you're the expert, and therefore they're going to do it, and they trusted you. Whereas sometimes you would find maybe some of the North American English-speaking athletes who thought they knew better wouldn't always do that. So, yeah, things like small oily fish, sardines, pickled herring, very easy to get the Scandies and the Europeans to eat that. Again, comparison of pickled herring to smoky streaked bacon, it was sometimes very difficult.
I can imagine it would have been. I recall there was a period of time when one of our high performance directors and head S&Cs in Rugby Australia with Dean Benton. He went through a process where guys that were underweight, he introduced having steak with breakfast. And I mean, in Australia, I think in North America as well, steak and eggs very common. But for so many players who want to have fuel, like they'll eat breakfast on the way out the door driving to the training facility, trying to fit in red meat and cooking this was just something that was quite bizarre. But at the end of the day, he said, old saying, taste buds don't know what time it is. So it's interesting. I'd love to talk to you, because I know this was one of the fundamental and one of the key features of the Fuelin platform. And maybe actually before I do that, I'd like to introduce Fuelin, because I'd like
even before you go there. So I know Dino, because Dino worked at Leicester.
Oh,
so
right.
It's
okay.
fascinating you say that.
Did he have the players eating steaks at 7:30 in the morning as well?
Well, the difference is, and we talk about the teams that I have worked in, is that we always provided food.
Yeah, and it makes a massive difference.
This is the huge difference. So in Oracle, we supplied all the meals. At Leicester, we supplied all the meals. So we had steak. And, that bringing in steak at breakfast, or chicken, or whatever form of protein, if you were in that dietary preference, into the meal and into the room at that time of day, it also took out the need for the player to worry about that, and we were doing it for them. And so that's what we did at the Maple Leafs as well. There was a big push from me, from Jeremy Bettle, who was the performance director at the time, working with the chef and making sure that, breakfast actually became like a full-on, experience that they had from, a type of protein, whether that was steak, chicken, turkey, a form of fish, even salmon in the morning, sardines, whatever it was. But there was always a protein source there to ensure that the athlete was getting the optimal amount of protein in, if they chose to use it, chose to eat it. I think it's very important, and I think there's still teams out there, and look, a lot of it is budget constraints, unfortunately. But if they want to, I think the teams that decide to put money towards nutrition and actually fueling their athletes correctly, I think the reward speaks for itself.
Absolutely. And I went off on a rant with an episode with Pip at the end of last year, and it all comes down to the priority hierarchy, right? In terms of where do you place nutrition and fueling in terms of the hierarchy of how you want your high performance to run. And I was always saying I found it so interesting that there was always someone there with a stopwatch for the ice bath, as opposed to someone with monitoring if someone who was underweight was going to the fridge and making sure they're having a snack immediately post-session. I just thought that was an interesting one to have there. But mate, I wanted to stay on that train of thought, because I think this leads really nicely into obviously Fuelin now. And it's all well and good for us to talk about athletes and have food provided for them, obviously eating in hotels when you're traveling as a team and individual athletes. But trying to relate that and actually make it relatable to a non-professional athlete, a semi-professional, and let's talk about the average age group in endurance sports, particularly triathlon. You've obviously picked up philosophies from professional sport and found a way to adapt them into people that don't have access and ready, on hand access to that type of nutrition, and that's what Fuelin is. But I thought, firstly, just let us know now. Tell us about Fuelin firstly, and obviously what your philosophies are in terms of nutrition and how you're helping, the everydayer now and the elite amateur athlete be able to perform and have a nutrition program like a pro.
Yeah, so Fuelin is a training-based nutrition app, and it's the world's first training-based nutrition app that syncs directly with the coach's training plan. So whether they're on Training Peaks, Today's Plan, or Final Surge, then what we do is sync with that via our API and provide the appropriate fueling and the correct fueling for every meal before, during, and after whatever the athlete is trying to complete. The focus and the priority or the purpose of the athlete is taken into account. So whether they're in a body composition focus or whether they're in a performance focus, what we do is use the program to deliver the appropriate amounts of macronutrients and total calories to that athlete. What we're really working on is the pillars of sort of what we talk about is being simple, being personalized, and results driven. And so everything is designed about eliminating sort of that decision paralysis around what should I eat before or after to maximize performance of the session and to maximize recovery, and then what type of fuel should I be consuming during that session in order to maximize the purpose of that session.
And I know there is, and I'll ask you to go into a little bit, but one of the unique features of the app when I was using it is obviously the traffic light system, which I know you implemented in there. And as you've said, the whole purpose of the program is to take out that decision, those barriers when it comes to decision making for non-professionals, because that is, if we can solve that as half of the problem, then a lot of people actually who are trying to get the best out of themselves are willing to go that extra mile. Well, we definitely know that in triathlon, the amount of time and resource people put into being the best possible versions of how they're performing of themselves, that nutrition is that next step. But knowing and having all the information in one place is where Fuelin comes in. But talk about that traffic light system, because for me, it was such an easy interface to learn from.
Yeah, I'll take a quote from James Clear, and it's that we don't rise to the level of our expectations, we fall to the level of our systems. Okay, and so if you don't have the system in place, then I'm paraphrasing James there, but if you don't have that system in place, you're not going to get your expectations or you're not going to achieve your goals. So what we're doing with Fuelin, exactly as you said, is providing a framework, much like you follow a framework in physical training. I'm sure if we're talking about an endurance athlete and a triathlete, and in particular Ironman athlete, they're following a training program. They should be following a system. And in much the same way, what we're doing is creating a system that allows the athlete to follow and follow simply. So with the traffic light system, something as simple as red being lower carbohydrate, yellow being moderate, green being higher, the athlete can simply look at their day's plan and say, okay, I've got a red snack. I've then got a bike session, which is going to be higher intensity fueling. I've then got a green meal after that to replenish glycogen stores and try and get ready for the next session, which could be in the afternoon. And then again, they can see simply, oh, I've got a yellow lunch and then I've got a red dinner. So they know instantly the amounts of carbohydrates and the type of carbohydrates that they should be doing. And so it becomes second nature to that athlete that they don't have to think about, oh, what's the intensity of this session? What's the duration of this session? How much do I need? And what types of carbohydrates do I require? Along with all the other macronutrients. It's taken out of their hands and actually just simplified and provided them in a very easy, digestible, excuse the pun, sort of format.
And I think the beauty about it is as well, is it's not just meal planning. You will go, the platform goes, and I know it's curated, from yourself right at the top. For anyone out there that thinks it's a plug and play model, it's not. Scott has a touch point on all the day-to-day planning. But what I found really unique is you also take them through the supplementation journey as well, which we know for endurance athletes is one of the places where there's quite a bit of minefield. A lot of them, there's skepticism out there in the world of supplements. You and I talk on it for hours. That's probably I think that's a fair assessment because of, the amount of miseducation and misformulation of supplements on the macro and micro side. So if we looked at performance nutrition as before, during, and after, talk us through your philosophy of Fuelin, how you take an athlete on a day-to-day journey through a supplementation as well as the whole foods as well, and probably use a training day as an example as opposed to a rest day perhaps.
We'll start with whole foods because it's we always talk about food first but not food only, and I think that's really important. And I know Graham Close coined that, and he actually wrote a paper about that it should be food first but not food only. Sometimes we have to consider supplementation to meet the needs of the athlete. And certainly with athletes such as an endurance athlete, I think supplementation can be extremely important and extremely vital to the success of that athlete from a health perspective, but also from a performance perspective. So Yeah, if we're looking, the way in which we structure the program is obviously we have to look at the purpose of the athlete. As I said, is it performance or is it body composition? What time of year are they in? Are they in the in-season or are they in the post-season? And then starting to layer in a number of other factors that come into that. So that would be the total week training volume. How does that compare to the previous week? What is the weight of the individual athlete? How many training hours have they got that week? And then what's the intensity and duration of the individual sessions within the day? So as we go through, there's about, I think at the moment, there's about 75 plus calculations that go into the formation of each individual day, because it's not as easy as just saying, oh, right, you've got a 60-minute low intensity bike ride here, so let's just give you a red meal beforehand and let's give you a green meal afterwards, because depending on what the rest of the activity for that day is, that's going to impact what we've probably fed them beforehand. And then the subsequent 24 hours, quite often one of the biggest responses, or one of the most surprise that we get from athletes is they might have on a Friday, they mainly do say a 30-minute swim, and they're always confused as to why they're taking in, say, 5 to 5.5 grams per kilo of body weight of carbohydrates on that day, because they're like, I'm only doing 30 minutes of exercise. But it's like, look at what you're doing on Saturday, and they're like, oh yeah, I'm doing a 6-hour brick. But most athletes aren't looking forward prospectively into what they're doing. They're only looking at the moment. And I know everyone says, like, be present, be in the moment, but sometimes we've actually got to look forward to the future to see what's actually required in that sense. So yeah, I think it's not an easy question to answer, because there are so many calculations and there's so many factors that go into thinking about what meal someone should eat before and after, and also the type of fuel that is consumed during. If we talk about the in-session fueling, it's probably a little bit easier, because that's going to be based around intensity and duration. Certainly if we're thinking about lower intensity, say Z2 or Z1, as it's often coined in terms of endurance programming, we're probably thinking lower carbohydrate, slightly higher fat, keeping the total calories up, again, depending on the purpose of the session, but certainly using lower amounts of carbohydrates in that instance. If we're talking Z3, race pace or above intensity or higher intensity exercise, and we're talking about a significant duration, say 70 to 80 minutes or above, then we're going to start to think about pushing higher carb fueling. So this is, again, people will listen to social media and that and say everyone's got to be having 90 or maybe 120 grams of carbs per hour. And it's like, well, yes, that's good for someone like Kristen Blumenfeld or Gustav Eden, who's, running 3.5-minute Ks, and they're doing, they're really pushing the boundaries of sort of human physiology. But for the average person, if they go and take in 120 grams of carbs per hour, they're probably just going to end up feeling very, very sick and probably have disaster pants, as we like to term it. So thinking about building in the layers of carbohydrate fueling and actually working out what your carbohydrate capacity is an important part of this as well. So you're not necessarily going to start off at the 120. You might establish a baseline. That baseline might be as low as, say, 35 grams per hour. And then you've got to start to build that into your weekly training program to improve the carbohydrate capacity of that individual athlete.
Exactly. And I think what you and the program does really well is you also can start to educate along the way those athletes. And I'd be keen to get your take on how deep you do take them, and some of the learnings that you get from your users along the way, because I mean, you're probably one of the performance nutritionists out there globally that can really, and I think you've got a really interesting take in terms of how you use macronutrients, and let's really focus on that in fuel, in training, in race fuel, and in terms of what you then need to supplement on the micro side of things as well, to actually get the most out of what you're actually doing as a 360 degree in terms of nutrition. And I think that's what I found out of the Fuelin platform when I was using it. You have the entire day covered and everything is purposeful. And one of the things I think is so, and I think the reason triathletes, I think, are the first probably early adopters in a lot of this technology, is the fact that they also understand the benefits of looking forward, but know when the day comes, because you're only ever one training day or one race day away from having a really poor performance. You need to have that data trend to look back and to know, what did I do in that period? And trends, just, for prehab, rehab, race fueling and nutrition is so vital. But I mean, what I suppose from a sound grab here for people, what's one of the most important things when you're looking at your macro side and in fuel, what can you do outside of that as well?
Do you mean in terms of supplementation, in terms of improving that?
Yeah. So in terms of trying to optimize what's actually going in your mouth and how you might be able to use supplements. If that's, and I imagine that is a common thing where people take whole foods and then ask for your advice on it.
Usually what we're talking about here is understanding why you're taking a supplement. So I think that and again, if you're talking about the new year, everyone's got these lofty goals and these grand ambitions, but they don't have a system in place. So if you're going to start with a system, start with some testing. So something as simple as getting a blood test done and looking at, a full blood count. If you're an endurance athlete, getting an iron panel done, looking at fasting glucose, maybe your HbA1c. Look at red cell magnesium, for instance, to get an accurate understanding of what your magnesium levels are. Is B12 low? Is B6 low? B9? Be zinc. Be systematic about what potentially do you have an insufficiency in or a deficiency, and where does that sit on that line of normal value? Because, you can have quite low ferritin, it can still be normal, but is it optimal for, say, an endurance athlete who's trying to do, 18 hours of training a week? So I would start there. Vitamin D is a classic one. Everyone in Australia thinks that, that they've got optimal vitamin D levels, and then you get them tested, and that most people are either insufficient or deficient. Now, the reason for that is because you look at, and I'm not saying the sunblock program is a problem in Australia. I think it's saved a lot of lives in terms of cancer prevention. However, 15 to 20 minutes of sun exposure in the morning without wearing your yoga pants that go down all the way to your ankle, with a full long sleeve and wearing your sunglasses and a hat first thing in the morning, is probably not optimal to enhance or allow your body to produce vitamin D. So again, vitamin D, get it checked. Have a look. If you are deficient, then you probably should start thinking about supplementing with that. And that's really I love supplements for the purpose of being purposeful and actually addressing things that need to be addressed. I think people can unfortunately waste a lot of money on supplementation and when it's not required. And so I think what you guys are doing at Pillar is creating a number of products that are actually specific to potential deficiencies or insufficiencies that athletes and lay people may actually present with.
Yeah, and I mean that was our philosophy from launching. Everything needs to be need state driven. When we look at products and we look at our customers, everything was based around my experience as an athlete, but we believed where nutrition was going to go and where those gaps probably hadn't been drawn, as you've said, between health and performance. We were talking about off air. There's that gap in the middle that we were trying to solve, because in our category of micronutrition, it had always been put down to health, but you have to be healthy to perform, which is where, which is what Fuelin does, and the way that the platform splits it up is really unique and one of a kind. And we probably won't dive too much further into it, but it's one of those ones where I can't recommend people enough to go and give it a go. If you are looking to take your training to that next level, the platform, we're really proud to now be working with you guys at Fuelin, because and because I understand how well curated and how much thought has gone into it.
Thanks, David. I think just on that point as well, think of something like think of your omega-3s. Yeah, people take omega-3s, and they should. I'm a big believer in omega-3s, but a lot of people actually have no idea how bad their omega-3 index is, or their omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. Now, you can get this tested. It's not free in Australia. It's not free in America. But you can just go to your doctor and ask for an omega-3 index. And the omega-6-3 ratio, if you want to get into it, is great. If we've got American listeners, reach out to a company called Omega Quant. They'll do something for about $100, and they'll give you a full breakdown of your full lipid profile. And it is fascinating to look at. Like, as an athlete, your omega index should sit somewhere between 8 and 12%. Now, I can guarantee you that no one sits in that 8 to 12% unless they're probably supplementing with an omega-3. And it is, I take the Pillar omega-3. Mine sits at 8.5%. I probably am not as religious with taking it as I should be, but I know my omega-3 level is actually very good. And that has been, because I've monitored it over time. I used to have a level that was probably suboptimal. I get a lot of delayed onset muscle soreness. There is more recent research related to omega-3 consumption and reduction in delayed onset muscle soreness and improvements in lean muscle mass gains. It's fascinating research. Do you know what? I get really sore after training. So what do? I want to reduce that soreness, so I take my omega-3s post-training. Does it work? It works for me. Does the science support the omega index? Yes, it does. It's good enough for me, and I think a lot of listeners out there should go and get tested for this and then think about, are you eating or are you consuming the appropriate amounts of omega-3s to do with you specifically?
Thanks, Scotty. And guys, there's some amazing nuggets in there, and we'll finish up now. But I think it's probably worth to note that Scott and his team do monthly Q&As and webinars on a lot of these topics. So we'll make sure we share the next webinar in the show notes below. Equally, guys, we're going to have Scott on talking much deeper about a lot of these topics, and I know there'll probably be a few questions coming in regarding the omega ratio and potentially how to look and supplement around that. But if there are any topics you do want to cover, if there's any questions specifically for Scott, please feel free to write them into the Pillar platform, and we'll make sure we pass those on and we'll cover them in another episode. But Scotty, really appreciate you coming on today. We've loved working together and looking forward to what we can build now as we launch Pillar into North America, and then obviously can start to help a lot more people with the micro side of things. And we know you've got them covered from a programming side, mate. So it's been a pleasure. Thanks for coming. And for everyone else, guys, that wraps up the start of the 2023 podcast season for us. Just remember, if you're listening on Apple or Spotify and you like what you hear, we'd love a review. But see you next time, and have a good afternoon and train hard.
Thanks so much, Damo.
Cheers, Scotty.